Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Super GHI ball python. The Super GHI consists of 2 copies of the code-dominant GHI gene. As a matter of fact, I actually put out a couple videos previously where I just focused on supers. You can actually, potentially you could base your whole collection around just supers. As a matter of fact, one of the best ones that I've seen is the Super Pastel. I actually put out a video about the Super Pastel, and there's a whole bunch of really awesome Super Pastel combinations to where you can almost base a whole collection, or at least like a whole rack, around this Super Pastel. And it's kind of the same thing with the Super GHI, except the Super Pastel is really bright and then the Super GHI is really dark. So it's kind of the dark side of the supers. You can make some really amazing combination mixing other genes into the Super GHI. As a matter of fact, I also did a video on the Super Vanilla. Those are probably the top 3 supers that you could actually work with: the Super Pastel, the Super Vanilla, and the Super GHI. Make some pretty amazing combinations. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the amazing potential of the Super GHI ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com, and I want to start with just one copy of the GHI gene so you can see what the GHI looks like by itself. And essentially what the GHI is, it's a dark morph just as a single gene. If you actually work it into other combinations, a lot of times it'll really darken the background of a lot of combinations. And kind of the cool thing about the GHI is it'll also really jumble up the pattern in a lot of your combinations. Like on the regular normal ball python, you have kind of these Roswell gray alien heads that you see on the side, and usually on the GHI you really don't see any of those alien heads. It really scrambles up the pattern. If you actually take 2 GHIs and breed them together, 25% of the time this is what you get. You get a Super GHI. Take a look at this beauty and talk about probably one of the most impressive dark combinations. The Super GHI is pretty impressive, and essentially what it is, it looks almost like the regular GHI, except it has a really super dark background. You can see it's really like almost an inkjet black in this specific example. Pretty amazing. And look at how dark the head is on this one. Pretty crazy. And a lot of times on the Super GHI it'll really kind of fade out the sides to where you can almost hardly see the patterns coming through the sides. And essentially the Super GHI also really reduces the pattern. You see in a lot of cases it really kind of brings them into these little kind of these interesting stripes on the side. I'd say the Super GHI is probably generally more reduced in pattern than just one copy of the GHI. So I kind of wanted to show you some of these other genes when mixed into the Super GHI. And the first one I want to start with is the Pastel. This is what a Pastel looks like. And I'd say as far as sheer numbers over here on Morphmarket, Pastel is #1 as far as the most common gene in all the ball pythons. Essentially what the Pastel does is it really brings in a lot of yellow colors, and it really kind of reduces the pattern even more. I'd say that the Pastel doesn't really reduce the pattern as much as the GHI, but it's definitely a pattern reducing gene. So this is what happens if you work Pastel into the Super GHI. Take a look at this beauty. This is pretty amazing. Essentially what it does is it really brings out more of the brightness of the lighter colors. And kind of the cool thing about this combination is that the Pastel is not really lightening the background. So that is really what you want in a lot of these dark combinations. Most people are actually going for the really super jet black background with really bright coloration layered on top of that background to make a really impressive dark morph. And kind of the other cool thing about this is you can definitely tell that Pastel is in the mix because it's really lightening the head, which is pretty common with the Pastels. As a matter of fact, Pastel usually turns the eyes green too. I haven't really looked close at the eyes on this one, but it almost looks like they could be kind of green. Makes for a really impressive combination. So take a look at this beauty. This is actually the addition of fire into Pastel. So this is the firefly. So if you go into the kind of the bright side of things, you can actually take fire and work it into Pastel to make a really super bright firefly. But if you actually take the firefly and you work it into the Super GHI, take a look at this crazy snake. This is the Pastel Super GHI. It says possible fire, but I'm thinking fire is definitely in the mix. And look, take a look at this thing. It's almost like a crazy metallic looking snake. Really awesome. I just love how it really kind of almost gives like a coppery color to the background and almost like a gold color on top of it. That is crazy. As a matter of fact, these Super GHIs are pretty expensive. And this one, yeah, this one actually sold for $1,800. That is a pretty amazing snake. So here is the lesser. The lesser is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, which gives you an all-white snake with blue eyes if you actually have 2 copies of genes in the blue-eyed leucistic. And I'd say the lesser is probably the king of white snakes when it comes to the blue-eyed leucistic complex. You can mix it with any other gene, like the lesser, the Mojave, the Russo, the special, the mystic, the phantom, or you can actually mix it with the bamboo, the snake that I have around my neck at the beginning and ending of every video. Bobby is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, so if you bred Bobby to a lesser, you'd actually get an all-white snake with blue eyes. And a lot of times when you mix lesser into other combinations, kind of apart from the blue-eyed leucistic complex, a lot of times you'll actually get a lot more contrast and a lot more brightness to the combination. So here's what happens if you work lesser into the Super GHI. Take a look at this. This is a pretty interesting combination. You can definitely tell the Super GHI is really turning the sides really black and kind of fading out all the color. And it looks like, to me, it looks like the lesser is really kind of enhancing the definition, then bringing in a little bit more brightness of the stripe right down the back. That is really crazy. I haven't actually looked at the prices on these. I was just kind of curious. This one actually sold for $800, so it's not too bad. Of course, when was this? This was, yeah, it was actually last year. So some of these Super GHIs can be really super pricey, because essentially what you're doing is you're trying to work another gene into a super, which is kind of like working on a recessive project. Because, for example, if you actually took the Super GHI lesser and you bred it to something else, you technically couldn't reproduce it unless you bred it to something else with GHI in the mix. And the other cool thing is if you actually take 2 Super GHIs and breed them together, everything in the whole clutch would all be Super GHIs. So you can actually breed 2 supers together and get all supers. Pretty powerful. So here is the yellow belly. And when it comes to kind of sleeper morphs, I'd say yellow belly is probably the king. The yellow belly is a really subtle morph by itself. And usually you can pick out little markers from the yellow belly. This one has these flames coming up right out the side. Usually they have kind of an orangish flame coming up from the belly that kind of indicates that it's yellow belly. Believe me, I've actually seen a lot of yellow bellies that have no flames at all. Sometimes it's really hard to figure out if a snake is yellow belly. And a lot of times you'll actually see kind of like a checkering on either side of the belly, like a really busy pattern that kind of shows you that it's yellow belly. And usually if you work yellow belly into some of the bright genes, like if you actually worked it into the firefly with the fire and the pastel, the yellow belly, the orange dream, all those, you get really bright and flashy snakes. So here's what happens if you work yellow belly into the Super GHI. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing. It really brightens it. It seems like it brightens it even more than the pastel using yellow belly into the mix. Pretty amazing. And essentially what the yellow belly is doing is really bringing in a lot more of the brightness of the kind of the bright top color of the snake. You can definitely tell it's not really darkening or lightening the background, which is pretty cool. It's really cool if you can actually find a dark gene that's not really influenced by some of the brightening genes as far as the background color of the snakes. That is really what you're looking for, is kind of the ultimate potential of a dark gene working other genes into the mix. So take a look at this one. This is actually the banana. And when it comes to visual dominance, I'd say the banana is probably maybe number 2. I was gonna say number 1, but I think the albino is number 1. You mix anything in with albino and you get an albino looking snake with kind of a jumbled up pattern. And the banana, I'd say it's a little more forgiving, but a lot of times when you work other genes into the banana, it usually looks like, you can definitely tell that banana's in the mix, and sometimes the banana completely dominates. And this is actually a co-dominant gene So if you bred it to something else, half the offspring would come out as banana. So here's what happens if you breed banana and work it into the Super GHI. Take a look at this. This is pretty incredible that the banana is dominating the visual appearance of the Super GHI, which is actually kind of surprised me that this combination wouldn't be a lot darker. And as a matter of fact, this one actually has pastel or super pastel in the mix. And I'm thinking that if with a closer look on this one, you can kind of see that the pattern is a little bit more jumbled up than just the GHI, the Super GHI. So I'm thinking this probably has super pastel in the mix, which would really reduce and jumble up the pattern even more. And let me tell you, if you actually have banana on top of a super pastel, that's probably where the visual dominance is coming from as far as overwhelming the Super GHI, but it's still a really amazing combination. So here is the Mojave. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Mojave GHI, it's probably one of my favorite combinations. Essentially what you get is you get kind of a really dark snake with a really bright highlighted line right down the top. The Mojave is also in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, but there's kind of some exceptions with the Mojave. So for example, the lesser, usually if you breed lesser with anything in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, you almost always get, I think you always get an all-white snake with blue eyes. With the Mojave, there's actually exceptions. If you actually breed it to certain genes, you get purple snakes like the Purple Passions or the Mystic Potions, which is a Mojave version of the blue-eyed leucistic with a little bit of color and pattern coming through, which is pretty awesome with the Mojave. So here's what happens if you work Mojave into the Super GHI, and take a look at this crazy snake. It is pretty amazing. It almost turns it into like brown, like almost a brown patternless snake with this little kind of a dotted line. As a matter of fact, if you actually just look at the GHI Mojave, usually that is a lot blacker and it has a brighter line on the top. For some reason, you actually add another version, another copy of the GHI to get the Super GHI, you actually get kind of a browned out snake, which is really kind of amazing. This is a pretty amazing snake. As a matter of fact, I was wondering on the price. This one was $1,200 too. I always look at the price, I kind of think, you know, would I actually buy that? How much is that snake? That is pretty amazing. So here is the Pinstripe, and the Pinstripe is one of my favorite genes. It's probably the brightest gold, almost like a metallic gold colored snake, and it's actually relatively inexpensive, so you can pick up Pinstripes for just a little more than like a normal or something like that. They're not expensive at all, and the Pinstripe usually has this really strong stripe right down the top of the back with kind of these little pinstripes right down the side. And here's what happens if you work Pinstripe into the Super GHI. Take a look at this. This is kind of interesting that the Pinstripe actually almost dominates the Super GHI. So it's always kind of interesting to look at kind of the level of visual dominance when it comes to some of these genes. And I actually considered kind of ranking them. You know, you can kind of figure out, you know, the albino's on top and then the Pinstripe. And I would say probably the albino's on top and then the banana is right under the albino. And when it comes to Pinstripe, it's definitely lower than like your bananas, but it's kind of in the middle where a lot of times when you work Pinstripe into a lot of combinations, you can definitely see the Pinstripe influence. But in this case, it almost seems like it completely dominates. So that's kind of what's cool about the Super GHI, is it's not really super visually dominant. You can actually work a lot of other genes into it and still get some really amazing combinations. So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is actually one of my favorites. So take a look at this. This is my new favorite. This is a Super Pastel Calico. And the reason this is my favorite, because I actually produced 2 of them this year for the very first time. It's a pretty awesome combination. So the Super Pastel is really super bright yellow. And then you work in the Calico and it fades it out into this really awesome looking snake. So take a look at this. This is what happens if you take the Super Pastel Calico and you work it into the Super GHI. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is like a Super GHI like I've never seen before. And it's kind of cool. You can actually make some really amazing combinations. And since the Super GHI is not really completely visually dominant, it works really well with a lot of other genes. And in this case, you get like part light on the bottom and then this really dark, kind of a dark outline, squiggly line right on the top. And this one actually has the price right in the description. description, 1,000. Sold for $1,000 back in just last year, 2019. Pretty amazing combination. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Josh Moore asks, is there a certain age in which female ball pythons are too old to breed? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I've been asked this question quite a few times, and from my understanding, pretty much what I've heard through the grapevine is that female snakes, female ball pythons are never really too old to breed. As a matter of fact, almost just the opposite is true. The bigger and older they get, usually the more eggs they lay. It's pretty incredible. And kind of the other interesting thing that I've also heard kind of through the grapevine is that there's no inbreeding problems with reptiles. So if you bred the offspring back to the parents, most of the times you don't see like the genetic deformities that you'd see in a lot of the other animals. And it's kind of interesting. I actually breed mice down here in my reptile room. I breed mice as a food source for my ball pythons, and I do like a colony breeding. I keep the males and females together all the time, and you get to the point, and the mice burn out really fast. As a matter of fact, after about 8 months, they get so old that they just don't produce anymore. It's kind of crazy. You can actually have really old males and females together, and the litter size gets smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they just don't produce. You'll have kind of these really old, they actually gain quite a bit of weight. They almost look pregnant in their old age, and they can kind of trick you because a lot of times you peek in there and you're like, all right, I'm waiting for the babies. And it's essentially what it is. It's just really old mice that don't breed. And I've never really seen anyone have the same problem with old snakes or old ball pythons where they just get to that point where they just don't lay eggs anymore. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.